Imagine you're sitting at a dinner party in Toronto. Your cousin announces she just got hired at a marketing firm. Your friend mentions he picked up a contract doing graphic design. The waiter overhears and says he's working 3 gigs through apps on his phone. Everyone's employed. The economy must be booming, right? But here's what nobody mentions. Your cousin's marketing job is 25 hours a week with no benefits. Your friend's contract pays $22 an hour with no guarantee of renewal. The waiter is driving for Uber between restaurant shifts because neither job alone covers his rent. This is the employment mirage. Canada is celebrating record job numbers while millions of people are quietly drowning. The headlines scream about job creation, but they don't tell you what kind of jobs we're creating or what those jobs actually pay. Today, we're going to crack open the employment statistics that politicians love to quote and show you the math they hope you never see. This is the story of how Canada became a nation of the working poor. Let's start with the number everyone celebrates. As of late 2024, Canada's unemployment rate hovers around 6.5%. By historical standards, that's not terrible. The government points to this and says the labor market is strong. More Canadians are working than ever before. But here's the trick buried in that statistic. The unemployment rate only counts people who are actively looking for work. If you've given up searching, you disappear from the data. If you're working 1 hour a week, you're counted as employed. The number tells you nothing about the quality of employment or whether people can actually survive on what they're earning. It's like measuring the health of a hospital by counting how many beds are occupied without asking if the patients are getting better. We need to talk about what economists call underemployment. This is the shadow crisis that the official statistics completely miss. Underemployment means you have a job, but it's not enough. Maybe you're working part-time when you need full-time hours. Maybe you have a degree in engineering, but you're stocking shelves at Loblaws because that's all you could find. Maybe you're technically employed by 3 different gig economy apps, but none of them provide benefits, job security, or a predictable income. Statistics Canada estimates that underemployment affects somewhere between 8 and 10% of the workforce, but that's likely a conservative number because it's notoriously hard to measure. These people show up in the data as success stories. They're employed, but talk to them for 5 minutes, and you'll hear a very different story. Here's where it gets darker. In the last decade, Canada has experienced massive job growth, but the composition of those jobs has fundamentally changed. We're creating positions, but we're not creating careers. Look at the data on job quality. Between 2015 and 2023, the majority of net new jobs created in Canada were either part-time, temporary, or contract positions. Permanent full-time employment with benefits, the kind of job your parents retired from, has been shrinking as a percentage of the workforce. We're replacing the stable 40-hour work week with a patchwork of precarious gigs. The technical term for this is the gig economy, but that phrase makes it sound innovative and fun. It's not. It's economic insecurity rebranded with an app interface. Think about what this does to a person's life. If you don't know your schedule 2 weeks in advance, you can't plan childcare. If your income fluctuates by 30% month to month, you can't budget. If you have no sick days, you go to work with the flu because missing a shift means you can't pay rent. This isn't flexibility. This is chaos. And the psychological toll is measurable. Studies show that precarious employment is associated with higher rates of anxiety, depression, and even physical health problems. Your body keeps the score even when the statistics say everything is fine. Now let's talk about wages, because this is where the picture gets truly bleak. Even if you have a job, even a full-time job, the math might not work anymore. Real wages, meaning wages adjusted for inflation, have been essentially stagnant in Canada for the last 15 years. In some sectors, they've actually gone backward. The average worker today has roughly the same purchasing power as they did in 2008, but the cost of housing has tripled and the cost of groceries has nearly doubled. You're running on a treadmill that's speeding up while your legs are getting tired. The Bank of Canada can talk all day about wage growth, but if wages go up 3% and inflation is running at 4 or 5%, you're losing ground. You feel poorer because you are poorer. Here's the mechanism that's driving this wage stagnation, and it connects directly back to the immigration and population growth we talked about in previous videos. When you flood the labor market with hundreds of thousands of new workers every year, you create what economists call a labor supply shock. Employers don't need to compete for workers anymore. There's always someone willing to take the job for less. This is particularly brutal at the lower end of the wage scale. Why would Tim Hortons pay $20 an hour when there are international students desperate for any income willing to work for $16.50? The market is saturated, and because labor has been made cheap, companies have zero incentive to invest in productivity, in automation, or in training. They just hire more bodies. It's economically rational for the employer, but it's a death spiral for the worker. Let's zoom in on a specific example because abstract numbers don't capture the human reality. Meet Sarah. She's 32, has a bachelor's degree in communications, and lives in Vancouver. She works as a social media coordinator for a mid-sized company. On paper, she's employed, she's a success story. But here's her actual situation. She's technically a contractor, not an employee, which means no benefits, no pension, no job security. Her contract renews every 6 months, so she lives in a state of perpetual anxiety about whether she'll still have income next quarter. She makes $50,000 a year, which sounds decent until you realize that after taxes, her take-home is about $38,000. Her rent for a one-bedroom apartment in a suburb of Vancouver is $2,200 a month. That's $26,400 a year, which means rent alone consumes 70% of her after-tax income. She doesn't own a car because she can't afford one. She's been trying to save for a down payment on a condo for 5 years, but every time she gets a bit of money together, an emergency happens. The dentist, a broken laptop, her mom needs help with bills. Sarah is the employment statistic. She's the success, and she's one bad month away from moving back in with her parents. This brings us to the term that's increasingly used to describe people like Sarah. The working poor. This used to be a phrase reserved for people in the developing world or the margins of society. Now it describes a huge and growing segment of the Canadian middle class. You have a job, maybe even a quote-unquote good job, but you can't afford the basics. You can't save. You can't plan. You're one crisis away from financial collapse. The social safety net assumes that if you're employed, you're fine, but that assumption is broken. Employment no longer guarantees security. Now we need to address the elephant in the room. Why are we creating so many low-quality jobs? Part of it is the structural shift in the Canadian economy. We've talked before about how Canada stopped investing in high-productivity industries like manufacturing, technology, and resource development. Instead, we doubled down on real estate, retail, and hospitality. These are service sector jobs, and service sector jobs tend to pay less and offer fewer benefits than industrial or technical jobs. When your economy is built on people serving coffee to each other and selling each other condos, you're not creating wealth. You're just moving money around in circles. The other part is deliberate policy. By suppressing wages through mass immigration and by refusing to enforce labor standards for gig economy companies, the government has essentially facilitated a race to the bottom. It's cheaper to hire precarious workers than to invest in Canadians. Here's what makes this particularly insidious. The government and the media will point to aggregate job numbers and say, look, we're creating opportunity. But they never break down what kind of opportunity. If you create 100,000 new jobs, but 80,000 of them are part-time retail positions paying minimum wage, that's not economic strength. That's economic decline disguised with good marketing. The headline number hides the rot. And because most people don't have time to dig into the data, they just accept the narrative. They blame themselves. They think if I'm struggling, it must be because I'm not working hard enough or I made bad choices. But the game is rigged. You're not failing. The system is failing you. Let's talk about what happens at the macro level when you have millions of people working but not earning enough to live. Consumer spending collapses. When people are spending 60 or 70% of their income on rent and groceries, they stop buying other things. They stop going to restaurants. They stop buying new clothes. They definitely stop buying houses or cars. This creates a feedback loop. Businesses see weaker demand, so they cut costs, which means more layoffs or more conversion of full-time roles into part-time gigs, which means even less consumer spending. The economy starts to eat itself, and the only thing propping it up is debt. Canadians are borrowing to maintain a lifestyle they can no longer afford with their wages. Credit cards, lines of credit, car loans, all of it is masking the underlying collapse in real income. The other consequence is political. When people work full-time and still can't afford to live, they get angry. They lose faith in institutions. They stop believing that hard work leads to success because they're living proof that it doesn't. This creates fertile ground for populism, for extremism, for social fragmentation. The social contract that underpinned Canadian society, the idea that if you contribute, you'll be taken care of, is breaking. And once trust is gone, it's very hard to rebuild. So what's the way out? The solutions are straightforward but politically difficult. We need to enforce labor standards for gig economy workers. If someone is working for Uber or DoorDash 40 hours a week, they're not an independent contractor. They're an employee, and they deserve the protections that come with that. We need to tie immigration levels to actual labor market needs, not to GDP growth targets. If there are a million unemployed or underemployed Canadians, we shouldn't be importing hundreds of thousands more workers to compete for the same jobs. We need to invest in high-productivity industries that generate high-wage jobs. That means supporting manufacturing, resource development, and technology sectors instead of pretending we can all make a living selling real estate to each other. And we need a tax code that rewards productive work instead of asset speculation. But here's the reality. None of this is likely to happen because the current system benefits the people who make the rules. Cheap labor benefits corporations. A flooded labor market keeps wages low, which keeps inflation low, which keeps the housing market propped up. The people at the top of the economic pyramid are doing great. It's only everyone else who's drowning. The employment mirage is politically convenient. As long as the unemployment number looks okay, politicians can claim success even as millions of people are working multiple jobs and still falling behind. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in Sarah's story, or you felt that creeping dread when you look at your bank account despite working 50 hours a week, you need to understand something. You are not lazy. You are not bad with money. You are not failing. You are experiencing the consequences of a 20-year economic experiment that prioritized short-term GDP numbers over long-term prosperity. The jobs exist, but they're hollow. The employment is real, but it doesn't pay enough to live. Canada has become a country where you can work full-time and still be poor, and that should terrify everyone. Because a society where hard work doesn't lead to security is a society on the edge of collapse. The job boom is fake. The struggle is real. And until we're willing to measure economic success by whether people can actually afford to live, not just whether they're technically employed, we're going to keep celebrating phantom victories while the foundation crumbles beneath us. The question you have to ask yourself is this: how long are you willing to work for a system that doesn't work for you? Let me know in the comments. And if this video helped you understand why you're exhausted despite doing everything right, subscribe because we're going to keep pulling back the curtain on the numbers they don't want you to see.